welcome to our special SPA program on the 20th anniversary of September 11th. My name is Betsy Fisher-Martin, and I am the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute here at AU. I'm also a double AU alum, having gotten my undergrad and grad degree here at AU in the School of Public Affairs and then the School of Communication. A couple years after I graduated in 2001, I was working as a journalist just down the street from our campus at NBC News, where I was the senior producer for Meet the Press with Tim Russert. 20 years later, after 9/11, those recollections for many of us who lived through those days are still very fresh. And while the fall of the World Trade Center in New York City is the indelible image that we have of that day, Washington, D.C., the surrounding area here was another focus of the plot, from the attack on the Pentagon to the potential attacks on Capitol Hill and, of course, the White House. So today we thought we would reflect a little bit, and we are joined by some SPA faculty and former students who were in DC that day, working in the White House, on the Hill, in the media, and here on AU's campus. We want to get their recollections of that day and their reflections on how 9/11 informs where they are today in their professional careers. We're joined by Neeta Mcbride. She is, of course, the director of the First Ladies Institute at SPA, and is a board member of the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics. And in 2001, she was in the White House working as a special assistant to President George W. Bush. And of course, during his second term, she also served as the chief of staff to First Lady Laura Bush, and she will share her story of that day with us. We also have Professor David Malet, who is an associate professor of government in the School of Public Affairs. And on 9/11, he worked on Capitol Hill, serving as a research assistant to national security and in national security for the Senate Majority Leader, Tom Daschle. And then, of course, Jason Binkendorf, who currently serves as the executive director here at AU of AU's Hillel, but is also a graduate of AU's School of Public Affairs. And on 9/11, he was just beginning his sophomore year here on campus, and he'll share his recollections of that day at AU as well. I want to let everybody know that we are going to save some time for questions. So we encourage you to, if you have a question, just go ahead and type that into the Q&A feature in Zoom, and I'll be sure to get to your questions toward the end of our discussion. So with that, I thought maybe we would start with Anita to share, and Anita has written an amazing account of that day for the White House Historical Association, where she has interviewed so many of her former colleagues, and really gives people who read this, and I encourage everybody to read it, just a really, play-by-play account of where people were that day, where they worked. So share a little bit with us, Anita, your story about that day, and also where everybody ended up, a lot of people from the White House ended up working, thanks to your quick thinking on where to go that day.
Well, thank you, Betsy. Thank you for moderating us in this conversation. It is actually, hard, I think, for all of us to believe that it's been 20 years, and particularly for all of us working at a university and the new student body that's coming in, this class of freshmen, guaranteed 100% of them were not born on 9/11. And so sessions like this are so important to share the history and the impact on our country at that time, but the far-reaching implications that it's had for all of us. And that is really one of the things that we tried to do with this article in the White House History Journal, where I am on the board of the White House Historical Association. And the journal is a quarterly publication that is always different themes in White House history. Well, this is one theme of what happened on 9/11 at the White House with the president and with the staff, that it had not really been fully ever documented for our publication. And we all know there's certainly plenty of stories of where the principals were, where the president was, the national security team, the vice president, but what the rest of the staff, the 1,800 people that work across the 18 acres from the East Wing to the West Wing to the old executive office building and new executive office building, and where they were, how they knew to evacuate, where they went, and what it was like to come back. So the article did not start out to be as lengthy as it is, Betsy. It was intended to maybe interview 15, 20 people, and it ended up interviewing over 60, because as once you are starting these stories with someone, they'll point you to someone else, another story that needed to be documented. And really what I found was, when you work at the White House, you feel a sense of invincibility. And I suspect, David will say some of that too, being at the Capitol, although that is more open to the public than the White House really is. So you feel a false sense of security. And when you're told to take off your shoes and run for your life and not knowing where you're going to go, it is startling. And it was particularly startling for 112 interns that was their first day on the job. And 90% of them had never been to Washington, D.C. before. And they're 18, 19, 20 years old. So I think our student body can understand that. That feeling.
And we as parents can now understand that too, right?
Absolutely.
Like sending your child to intern in Washington, and then this.
That's right. And this happens to them. But I think, just long story short, because I know we'll have other things to talk about in this session, it was a cathartic experience for everybody that I talked to, from cabinet officers, Mitch Daniels, who served as the director of Office of Management and Budget, later went on to be governor of Indiana, and now is president of Purdue University. What his experience, he said, I don't remember a lot about my 3 years working at the White House, but that day I remember vividly. And he recounted his experience. Mine was, I was having breakfast in the White House mess with a colleague, just having coffee. And we had heard, like everybody else, a plane hit the World Trade Center, thinking it was a terrible accident. And then went about our business. But as we left the mess, unbeknownst to us, the second plane had hit the second tower, and the Secret Service were scrambling to tell us to get everybody out of their offices and bring them down to this windowless room, which at the time was thought to be a safe place to be. But our time there was brief, as the message had gotten to the Secret Service that a plane was coming at us. At least that's what the control tower at Ronald Reagan National Airport, that's what they reported. They didn't know. And of course, as we know now, it struck the Pentagon. But the chaos to leave, and many people in the old executive office building didn't know, didn't get that kind of direction that we did. In fact, one of the speechwriters said he had his television on in his office, and his mother called him and said, did not have the television on, and just said his mother called him and said, I'm watching on TV that the White House is being evacuated. Well, she's in Wisconsin, and he is right there at the old DOB. But I ended up, to finish off and answer the last part of your question, I found myself in Lafayette Park with many senior people of the White House staff standing around me that I knew instinctively, having worked at the White House twice before in 2 different administrations, this is not right for these people to be out here in the open. So I called. The one call I was able to get out on my phone, and we had flip phones then, no Blackberries, was my husband, who was running government affairs at Daimler Chrysler at 14th and 8th Street, and asked if I could bring some people there. Well, he said, of course. And he had all of his staff leave their computers on and leave their passwords, knowing that the White House staff would want to continue to work. And we did. There were 72 of us that worked there that day.
And they was well documented too. You wrote about how, there was a photographer there. You took some of the papers that are in the National Archives, and they really, had to plan out, again, next steps, where the president was going to go, what was he going to say, and, had to continue
That's
working.
Right. Well, there was a cross section of people that were there, speechwriters that were there and already knew. They began researching for the president's speech that night, researching the significance of this day. Why was this day picked to attack us? The schedulers, the head of the presidential scheduling unit was there, the head of political affairs, the head of cabinet affairs, legislative affairs. A couple of those more senior people the vice president wanted them to come back to the White House. So a Secret Service agent came and got some of the top folks. But the schedulers were already beginning to frame out what the president's next few days would be, because they knew he would want to go to New York and he would want to go to the Pentagon. And yes, one of the photographers had evacuated with us. And between the photographer that was with the president that day and the photographer that got caught in the scrum of evacuating the vice president down to the bunker, and the photographer that was with Laura Bush on Capitol Hill, and the one that was us, I mean, documented some of the most incredibly historic moments in White House history that we'd ever, an unprecedented day in the White House.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about the Capitol and bring in David here and your experience working for Tom Daschle. And tell us a little bit about where were you that day, what happened, and your story about being in the Capitol.
Yeah, thank you, Betsy. In some ways, it parallels what Anita described, but in some ways, things were actually very different down Pennsylvania Avenue. So I'd moved to Washington in August 1998 to get a master's in national security studies. It was the same month that Al-Qaeda attacked a couple of American embassies in Africa, and between that and a previous Al-Qaeda attack on the World Trade Center back in 1993, in which 10 people were killed in a truck bombing, that seemed to me like the sort of issue area that I should be focusing on. And a couple of years later, there I was working for the Senate Majority Leader, and I was a few minutes late to work that day. My fiance's car was in the shop. I ended up taking the metro, and I walked in probably a few minutes after 9. And by that time, both planes had hit the towers. But there was nothing amiss with the Capitol Police. Nobody was acting differently in the elevators.
Yeah.
It's just when I walked into our office's lobby, the TV was on, and it looked like initially what I thought was a smokestack. And then I realized it was a burning building. And then when I realized which building was burning, my first reaction, I guess studying what I'd studied, was, oh no, not again.
Right.
So I ran to my desk to try to make sense of what was happening. And, the internet was down. We weren't getting any sort of information in that way. So I put on the desk, the TV at my desk, and I had on NBC News, and I was watching coverage, and the Pentagon correspondent reported that it seemed like there was a big explosion that had just gone off at the Pentagon. So this was clearly something that was not just limited to New York. And a few minutes later, we got the word, I think through our office manager, to evacuate not just the Hart Senate office building where I was working, but evacuate the Hill and evacuate the federal district, get out of Washington, D.C., which was what we were told. Not everybody, and I was actually surprised how orderly it was leaving the building. People were not panicking, maybe because they were numb. It seemed almost just like a routine fire drill walking down the steps of the Hart building. It was a different experience for other colleagues who worked in different offices belonging to Senator Daschle. I had one colleague who was working in the leader's office in the Capitol, and the police officer on duty started yelling at them, "Get out, there's a plane headed for us." And he told me he ran down the Capitol steps expecting to see an aircraft coming in at him over the National Mall. But I had other colleagues who were working in the basement under the Capitol who never got any alarms and didn't evacuate because nobody ever told them to. And obviously it would not have gone very well for them had a plane hit the Capitol. So I found myself, on the way outside with a lot of people. It's important to note that there was no real contingency plan in place for this. The leaders of the House and Senate were helicoptered out to a Cold War nuclear bunker, but every other of the hundreds of members of Congress and their thousands of staff members were just left standing around with no plan in place. And, as I mentioned, I'd studied some of this stuff in grad school. I wasn't going to get on the metro. I didn't have my car, and I thought about this seemed like a good opportunity to do something to the subway system based on what had happened in Tokyo a few years earlier with the terrorist attack on the subway there. So I just started asking, hey, is anybody going to Virginia, where I lived in Arlington at the time? And there's a guy in another one of our offices who I'd never met before who said, yeah, get in. And we were in his car driving around the Beltway. There's this huge plume of black smoke coming up from the Pentagon, just rising high up, flattened out against the sky, just drifting across D.C. And the radio, we heard that both towers had collapsed, but we also heard a lot of other reports. We heard that there were explosions going off at the Capitol that sounded like we'd just gotten out with our lives. There were explosions going off at the State Department, that the mall was on fire, all these things that turned out to not be true. But the information was just not good at the time, and there was no cell service. One of the big East Coast cell towers was on top of one of the World Trade Center towers, so you couldn't reach people. So, this coworker of mine, I spent a few hours in his apartment before he gave me a ride, and I walked the last few miles, past the police blockade back to my apartment. But we spent hours not being able to get in touch with anybody, not getting a sense of who was okay and who wasn't. By the time I got home in the afternoon, I remember I called my grandparents and I asked them, 60 years ago, 1941, is this what Pearl Harbor Day was like? And my grandmother, said, actually, no, it wasn't like this at all, because back then, hours later, we heard about it on the radio that night. And now we're just watching
real time.
Right. We're watching live coverage all day long. It's a completely different experience.
Right.
So this was just completely unprecedented. And, it turned out that I didn't personally, everybody I knew was checking in safe in New York and DC. The flight that hit the Pentagon was the one I normally took home to LA for holidays. So I'm glad I wasn't, on it that day.
Yeah.
A high school friend of my wife's was working at Cantor Fitzgerald, where the first plane hit in the Trade Center. So, did indirectly know somebody who was killed almost immediately. And it was clear that things were just going to be different, right? We were instructed that federal employees had to report back to work the next day. Still didn't have my car. I got back on the metro, and there were a lot fewer people than usual, but there were people standing around. I remember seeing an empty seat next to this older man who was clearly a civil servant on his way to work, in his suit, but he was an older South Asian man wearing, the Hindu turban and a beard, and nobody wanted to sit next to him, clearly, and I did, but I was like, this is, to have this xenophobia coming out immediately was something that was there too. And other things changed, right? I remember that the thing that was almost scarier to me than anything else, we had a bomb threat at the Capitol a couple days later. If you were watching C-SPAN at the time, you would have seen members of Congress running off the floor, not what you're used to seeing on C-SPAN. And when we evacuated the building that day, it was a completely different, the panic in the air was palpable. And it would have just taken one twisted shoe on the stairs and people pushing for it to get really ugly. It was a different experience. Driving in DC was so strange because everybody was almost frighteningly polite. Nobody went over the speed limit. Nobody cut anybody off. It almost seemed like everybody was expecting to die any moment and just wanted to have, clean souls when they did. And that lasted for a while. Reagan National Airport was closed, and they said it would probably never open again for a while because the security risk was too great. So, just going home for the holidays that year was
And then, of course, some members of Congress came back to the Capitol that night and, sort of had that impromptu moment on the Capitol steps where
they sang God Bless America. It was a bipartisan gathering of people who normally were not working well together at all. And that was one thing that I think we hold up as being different from the 9/11 period versus today, that the country came together very quickly. I think things were a little bit different in the sense it was an external enemy. Al-Qaeda didn't have a domestic political constituency, so there's nobody in media or elected office who was sort of giving a different message. So that's one thing I think that's different than current challenges today. But the Hill was a different place to work. Obviously, a lot of security restrictions went into place after that. And then a month later, just the day that President Bush ordered it's finally time to raise the flags back up to full staff and try to go back to normal, was the day that Senator Daschle's office, where I was working, got the anthrax mailing. And things were never quite the same there after that.
Yeah, I want to come back and talk about that with you, and also sort of the legislation and sort of post 9/11 and kind of what that means in today's world. But I want to bring in Jason, who was a sophomore here at AU on campus the day of 9/11. And tell us a little bit, Jason, about your experience, how the students were here, how did it in fact impacted the campus. I mean, certainly if there was not a lot of communication with people on the Hill and the White House, there probably wasn't also a lot of communication with students on a campus.
Right. Well, I was a sophomore by credits, but I was actually in my first semester at AU. So I was brand new.
Oh, you were an overachiever high school student. Okay.
So I was exactly where perhaps some of the students watching were a couple of weeks into my time here, still figuring out who my friends were going to be and where my classes were and all of the things that new students are figuring out in the very early weeks of their time here. I was not any place fancy or important when I heard the news. I was asleep in my bed in Hughes Hall and heard people in the dorm yelling and was woken up and had the immediate reaction that probably most of the students can relate to, being woken up by yelling in the dorms, and you're annoyed and wondering what people are being, so loud about. And took me a few minutes to fully wake up and hear and process what people were telling me. And then the folks on my floor did what I know folks on every floor in all of the residence halls did, which is we gathered in our lounges with our floor mates watching TV, mostly in silence, just in shock, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. We almost immediately identified the folks on our floor and neighboring floors who had parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles working either at the World Trade Center or nearby, and there were several. As was already mentioned, cell phones weren't working, email wasn't working. There was no way to find out who was where and who was safe or wasn't. And we were, only a couple of weeks into our college experience. So we weren't sitting alongside our best friends. We had just met. We were maybe, forming friendships, but this was not yet a well-established community, at least for my class year. So we were trying to support one another and be there for one another, but without the benefit of knowing people's families or their stories or everything that they, the lenses of lived experience through which they were processing the day's events.
And so many students from New York, must have been terrified about, the safety of their family.
Absolutely. I remember a classmate who was from Long Island, but her dad at the time worked in Manhattan. And I remember her sobbing and saying, I shouldn't have gone to college. I shouldn't have left. Suddenly that survivor guilt, and thank God her family was okay. But she didn't know that. And in that moment, she felt guilt-ridden that she'd moved down to Washington for school just days before, this happened and her father was potentially, in danger. What I remember a few hours later, and much of that day is a blur, but after we'd been in our lounge for hours, we wanted to see other people. We wanted to get air. We wanted to gather with larger community. So a few friends and I decided we would walk over and see if there was anything going on at the K Spiritual Life Center. We hadn't heard anything, but we decided to walk over. And what we found was that hundreds of other students had the same thought we'd had, that just instinctively, so many of us felt like K was the place on campus to gather in a moment of tragedy and in a moment of fear. And so by the time it was getting dark, there were hundreds, maybe thousands of students. I think it was probably by a certain point, the majority of students who lived on campus were either in the K Center or sitting huddled on the steps and the quad in front of K. And as somebody who's now had the privilege of working in the K Center for many years, that's a memory that's always been so powerful for me, the power of a space of gathering and spiritual comfort. It's interesting to hear David talk about September 13th and the bomb scare at the Capitol, because for me also, September 11th and September 13th are tied very closely together. We were all, of course, in shock on the 11th, and AU canceled classes on the 12th. It was hard to get around DC. Everyone was still scared and trying to process, so we laid low on the 12th. And the 13th, we were back to class. And I had a class first thing in the morning in Hearst Hall. And while that class was going on, we were evacuated. And in fact, the entire campus was evacuated. So you have to picture this, students, that at the time, what we now call East Campus didn't exist and was just a massive parking lot, that entire side of the street. And the entire campus was evacuated over across the street to the parking lot. I thankfully was dressed because I was in class, but people were pulled out of bed and pulled out of the shower. And I remember the then president of the university getting on a bullhorn and getting our attention and telling us that there had been a bomb threat against campus that morning and that we all needed to leave and not come back until further notice. Because at that time, campuses didn't have plans for what you do in case of bomb threat. There was never something that had been seriously contemplated. And for me, and I think for so many students at the time, not only was it close to home, but it contributed to this continued feeling of uncertainty. Just when we were beginning to process what had happened on September 11th and certainly just beginning to process it, but trying to figure out how to move forward with some degree of normalcy, to go to class, to have lunch, to live a normal day, even, in the wake of such a huge event. And the bomb scare just kind of upended that entirely. and subsequent events continued. So as a young person, it just became this ongoing struggle to achieve any degree of normalcy and sense of stability. And that really carried forward for weeks, if not months, I think, for all of us as students. This wasn't just one day. This was this continued source of really existential anxiety that I think is hard to deal with at any age, but certainly for me as a college freshman was a real challenge.
Mm-hmm. So, Anita, let me ask you, and talking about moving forward and sort of the days after 9/11, how was that in the White House, coming back to the White House, obviously having this kind of daunting new challenge ahead of how to deal with this? How was that for you coming back into that environment?
Well, a couple of things, and I would like to add to something David said, because it really struck me that he asked his grandparents, was this what Pearl Harbor was like? And they said no, because of course they didn't know till hours later. And I think that's really something to understand in our modern world. On 9/11, 2 billion people across the world saw this happening, saw it on television, saw it on their computers. 90 nations were affected. That in itself too was an unprecedented exposure to what happened here really affected the whole world. And I think the other, thing too, to going back the next day, like the Capitol Hill staffers, the White House staffers, there was a phone tree telling all of us on the night of 9/11 to be back at work the next day. And the street.
I'm not sure students today even know what a phone tree is anymore.
Yeah.
Describe what that is.
I know. So there was, the head of each office, would have an administrative assistant that had everybody's contact information and called everybody on their individual staffs to tell them to come back. And that included the interns as well, which 95% of them came back. There were some that were a little traumatized and didn't at first. And there was one case where the parents drove up here and drove their child home and just didn't want them to be here in Washington. So going back, everything had changed, of course. Even access to the complex had changed. Beyond the fact that there were military presence around the complex, and the perimeter had been pushed out so much further, and there were military tanks in the road. But I did drive in that next day and got through the labyrinth. But just, from a procedural point of view, everything changed. We had to change a pass system because of your identification system to get inside the complex. Because, honestly, we didn't know where the threat was coming from and if the threat was even, amongst us. We began to plan to take, because I was in management administration, of course, every single office that was on the 17th Street side of the executive office building, meaning facing the streets or more vulnerable to attack, from ground floor to 5th floor, every single one of those offices had to be relocated off those exterior offices, and they were relocated to other government offices, General Service Administration locations in the environment of the White House, so within a few blocks. But just technical things like that.
Yeah.
But then from a policy point of view, everything. Think about where the president was on 9/11. He was doing a No Child Left Behind education event, because that was the biggest domestic legislation pending in Congress on that day. In fact, Laura Bush was up at the Capitol getting ready to brief Senator Ted Kennedy's Education and Labor Committee on education reform. That was the focus of the administration, was domestic issues. And of course, that all changed immediately. Not that you can ignore some of those things. And David knows, of course, the priorities now for legislation changed completely, indemnifying the airlines so that they could fly again, because all planes were grounded. If you can, imagine not having any planes in the air here in Washington other than fighter jets that were surveilling around Washington, which was odd in itself. The other thing was, of course, the financial markets had to be stabilized. And the head of the stock exchange, opened the markets just a day or 2 days later. But then there was, of course, aid for New York. President Bush had met with Senator Schumer and Senator Clinton, who is now a new senator representing New York, and talked about what they needed. And the fact is, of course, they needed a lot. And that was a $40 billion package that had to be almost immediately approved. So the legislative affairs team at the White House, some of the, and of course, national security team were meeting, and OMB were meeting with the Congress that night and well into the night on these new priorities that no one could have predicted on September 10th. And one other thing I will just mention, because I think what David said was really important about being on the Metro the next day and having, a Indian general or Hindu, whoever his faith might have been, sitting next to you, and no one wanted to sit next to them, and the xenophobia that did set in right away. And that was one of the things that was important from the perspective of leadership that President Bush did 2 days after 9/11, was go here on Massachusetts Avenue to the mosque, to the Islamic Center, and said, this is not a war with Islam. This is a war against terror. And that was really, those things are really important to remember, because he knew that, because he obviously was not ignorant to what was being said, around the country, what the American people were saying in their shock and grief. And this is not the direction that we needed to be going in, to be fighting each other. This was a fight.
And I remember I was at NBC and producing Meet the Press, and we 5 days after 9/11 on September 16th had a big interview with Vice President Cheney from Camp David. And that was a big point that he, even in that interview, tried to get across as well. And so I know it was very top of mind for the administration at that time. And I definitely remember him talking about that and making a point about it. And then he also, of course, had the kind of the quote there that the world has shifted in some respects. And then, of course, talking about kind of the military response and gonna have to kind of walk through and work on the dark side. Remember, that was the big quote about, then our kind of intelligence services and sort of what was next. But David, let me ask you on that, the part about legislation and sort of how Congress came together, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier, came together in sort of this bipartisan fashion to enact certain pieces of legislation, to actually form a bipartisan commission to study 9/11, passing the Patriot Act, which then, of course, later became, that Patriot Act, I think, was unanimous except for one no vote. And then, of course, months later, things kind of came back to sort of the partisan polarization that we know today. But talk about your experience just on the Hill in terms of policy that during those times.
Yeah, it's interesting in a way, because 2001 was almost a political mirror of 2021, right? You had a very divided, contested presidential election. In that case, it was President Bush didn't win the popular vote, but the Supreme Court was involved. There was no, Al Gore, who lost, didn't contest it beyond that point, but there were a lot of lingering bad feelings. Congress was as closely divided then as it is now. Republicans controlled right after the election both houses, but they had a 5-seat vote and a margin in the House. And it was a 50-50 Senate, just like now. And the only reason that Tom Daschle went from being minority leader to majority leader a couple of months before 9/11 was a Republican who was Bernie Sanders' predecessor, and from Vermont, switched and became an independent. So my boss at the time was pretty new to being sort of a national, party leader, beyond just being a Senate leader, was new to foreign affairs as well. And he was, I remember, he gave a speech a couple months earlier that we need to worry now about not about sort of Soviet missiles and focusing on Russia, but on terrorists with backpacks, and that was seen as controversial. But as Anita was saying, right after 9/11, people really unified, at least symbolically, temporarily. Right. The Patriot Act is sometimes held up as an example of that maybe going too far. That sometimes there wasn't enough legislative oversight, there wasn't enough questioning. If you watch the Michael Moore documentary or sort of documentary about 9/11, you see members of Congress saying, "Well, I didn't read the thing, but I voted for it." So here you had this massive sweeping reorganization of national security, including introducing a lot of domestic surveillance gathering powers that Congress had rolled back in the 1970s because of prior abuses. But suddenly they were back because people said, well, maybe we wouldn't have had 9/11 if those hadn't been in place. And there was not a lot of dissent. And over the next few months, I think there were probably people who didn't necessarily in Congress and around the country didn't necessarily agree with every step being taken, let's say about counterterrorism measures, later on with the invasion of Iraq. But you could be, and in some cases were, portrayed as unpatriotic if you didn't support it. You said that it was said you had a September 10th mentality, you just didn't get what needed to be done. And in some cases, there were actually some Democrats who I think took even a harder line than the Bush administration did about wanting to create DHS more quickly than the administration did, or TSA, or having questions about going into Iraq. And there's one who's actually my downstairs neighbor in my apartment, a senator from Georgia, Max Cleveland, who's a triple amputee in Vietnam, who, because he said, I don't agree with what they're doing on DHS, I want to move in a different direction. There were commercials run, and he lost re-election for being not sufficiently patriotic. So, in the couple of years after 9/11, I think there was a lot of, again, people being on the same page was driven sort of by domestic political considerations as well. Yeah. I'm not sure there was a lot of disagreement, though, in terms of substantive policy, that anybody would have really done anything very differently. The biggest disagreements seem to be about whether you would create federal agencies like DHS, or whether you should create, have more unionized federal workers in TSA instead of relying on private contractors. So I think students today say, well, why did people just sign up for this open-ended commitment to Afghanistan, and why didn't they think about this war on terror? And the reactions, everybody was terrified. And the idea was we need to secure the country as quickly as possible. We are in these uncharted waters. And I think there was a pretty broad consensus that we should take whatever steps are necessary to do that. And later on, that led to debates about, well, they're detainees from Afghanistan who are being, what the U.S. military code would call tortured for information. But, would you not want that information? Are you willing to observe these niceties of international law if it means another attack on New York, perhaps with nuclear weapons? So the country is really riveted, and I think it's hard to remember not having had a major incident like this since 2001, 20 years. Mm-hmm. Shows that clearly something was going right because there were further plots. My students today don't know that you used to be able to go through X-ray machines in the airport with your shoes on. It was because of Christmas time, 2001, just a couple of months after 9/11, that there was a bomber, a British citizen who was trying to fly, I think it was from Paris to Orlando, who had plastic explosives in his sneakers, and he tried to set them on fire on the plane. In that case, people remember 9/11 very vividly and beat him up and tied him up. Right. But there were these ongoing plots. And so there wasn't a sense that 9/11 was one and done and we could afford to back off. And so I think that really also greased the legislative wheels and made it easy to find common ground, the sense of common threat.
And then I think one of the other, impacts of this was sort of this kind of call to public service that many people felt. And Jason, can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, as somebody who was on campus and has worked with students and mentored students along the way, and sort of that sense of public service that people after 9/11 had, and that impacted, their own direction in life.
Absolutely. Look, we were AU students, so even pre 9/11, we know that the students who are drawn to AU are so often, young people who want to make a difference in the world. And I absolutely think that was reinforced by what we saw on 9/11 and in the days and weeks that followed. I think that folks open themselves up to different areas of interest in terms of ways they could make an impact in the world. Friends that were thinking primarily about domestic politics suddenly said, wait a second, I need to take a more global approach. I had friends who switched their majors from one set of majors to another to really help them prepare for a career in diplomacy or national security issues or whatever it might be. So I absolutely think both collectively and individually, there was an even greater focus on public service. I think for a lot of folks, they were wrestling with kind of notions of patriotism. I can't speak to how today's students think, but I think for my generation of students, old-fashioned, quote unquote, patriotism had not been so much in vogue. We'd grown up in an ironic, kind of cynical culture that even those who were oriented towards public service didn't necessarily think about that as kind of flag-waving, patriotic. That wasn't the framing. And I think for a lot of my classmates, they did find themselves embracing kind of more classical notions of patriotism and public service, and others who said, I want to be involved in public service and I want to hold on to a more cynical approach, and who maybe were reluctant about some of the, David was talking about what we saw about initial unity and then emerging concerns around the Patriot Act and other steps. I think very quickly my peers were having those conversations just as they were happening in the media and on Capitol Hill. I'll say one particular area that I think really drew the attention of many of my friends and mine as well was interfaith dialogue and interfaith solidarity work. I think for a lot of us that, we saw it as positive. Certainly we weren't opposed, but it wasn't something that all of us were attuned to thinking about much. And in the days that followed, it drew our attention quite a bit. Our Muslim classmates on campus in particular were experiencing a lot of fear in the wake of 9/11, I think understandably so. And so I remember sitting with one Muslim friend, but a few Jewish students, a few Christian students maybe not affiliated with any religious community, and thinking about what we could do. And we organized essentially an escort service that any Muslim student who was going to or from class or wherever they may be going, who wanted to have another student or two accompany them for their walk, we would make ourselves available to do that. And a number of Muslim students took us up on that. And that over the course of months actually became the foundation for what became the AU Interfaith Council, which existed for many years as a vehicle for interfaith learning and dialogue. And so I think that was a really positive, obviously it's horrible to talk about silver linings with something so tragic, but the tragedy pointed us towards something that hadn't gained our attention previously and really desperately deserved it.
Mm-hmm. And there's also a monument or marker on campus about 9/11, and there were some alums, I think, that were lost in the World Trade Center attack. And so as you kind of reflect, though, on these commemorations of 9/11, over the years that you've been on campus working with students, do you feel that there is, a sense even now in this kind of next generation about what we've learned from that and sort of the community and bringing people together? Or do you think that maybe there's not as much attention paid to it and it's something that students don't think about as much?
I think there continues to be real commitment on the part of so many of our students to intercommunal solidarity, not always in a religious framework, but I think this generation of students is much more attuned to what it means to be both confident in your own identity and to be engaged as an ally to other communities. I think it's night and day to look at students before 9/11 and this generation of students, and I think that's really wonderful to see. And I think this generation of students is much more conscious of the ways in which America is intertwined with the rest of the world. I think the world we live in today and the way this generation views the world recognizes that in a way that wasn't at all a given 20 years ago before 9/11, that everything that America does in the world impacts people around the world and has downstream ramifications that may not always be obvious. I think the conversation among students is far more sophisticated about that than it was in the past. So I do think actually that some of the positive takeaways have remained, even while probably most of today's undergrads couldn't point to some of the specific ways in which their lives have been shaped by 9/11.
Interesting. Anita, I want to go back to you on this notion of public service and talk about how 9/11 shaped your work with the First Lady and the commitment that you all had, especially toward women in Afghanistan and education of women, and that has been a marker of the work that you've done even since you left the White House.
Well, I think, it picks up perfectly from what Jason just said, that our student body and this generation of students understands more than even we did 20 years ago, just how incredibly interconnected and interdependent all of us are around the world. And that the shock wave to us at the time and to Americans generally is what was happening in this faraway place that no one could even point their finger to on a globe. Afghanistan affected us so profoundly and so deeply, and that there were so many people intent on training to kill us. And that's exactly what it was this, profound epiphany, and how our intelligence agencies were not cooperating with one another to share that information. The CIA had been tracking this, and it had been part of the briefing since David, said, of course, the bombings at our embassies in Tanzania and in Nairobi, and then the USS Cole in the Gulf of Aden. And so this was building, but now, it was thrust at us in such a violent way. And the whole direction, of the country and the priorities to, protect the nation shifted overnight, and in fact, the 9/11 report, the commission, the bipartisan commission, has a really interesting phrase in there that 9/11 was partly a result of a lack of imagination. And can you imagine using that word? And you saw that, that because we could not imagine that this would happen to us here, that these attacks would be planned against us in our country. And so you had to shift differently. And the part of building the case for not only, the unity behind going after those who attacked us and stopping that, but it was this explosion of understanding of what a regime like the Taliban was doing to people in that country, particularly women. And that you can't imagine in the 20th century or 21st century now that women's nails were being ripped off their hands because they dared to wear nail polish, or that they were forbidden to going to school. There was an entire generation, 20 years, of women who had been uneducated in Afghanistan, and that women couldn't go outside the home without a male escort. Well, what if you're a widow because your husband was killed in the Civil War, either when the Soviets, came in and invaded Afghanistan, or when the Taliban regime, came in? So they're confined to their homes. They can't support themselves. And that was something that really became a calling too for the administration. Laura Bush did a remarkable thing in November of 2001. I mean, I was not working in her office at that time, but at this point, I'm now over at the State Department. And we were already building a concept around a U.S.-Afghan Women's Council. But Laura Bush took the podium, the presidential podium, a radio address, and talked about what was happening to women in Afghanistan. And it resonated with women in the United States in huge ways. And in fact, one of the first people that Mrs. Bush's office had heard from was Hillary Clinton's former chief of staff, Malet Verveer, a good friend to both you and mine, Betsy. And she had served as Hillary, the now Senator Clinton's chief of staff when she was first lady. And she called and she said, that's something that was so brave to do that. It was something that Mrs. Clinton could never have done because the different perception around, no one expected that out of Laura Bush.
Right.
And so it became her calling to work with Afghan women, try to bring education to them, try to bring, one of the other pillars was healthcare. This was the highest infant and mortality rate in the world was in Afghanistan because women did not have access to healthcare. They didn't have access to an education. They couldn't work. So economic empowerment became a huge piece. And then the biggest one of all was in political leadership. And now, 20 years later, all of those gains, incredible access that these women have had to now be parliamentarians, judges, lawyers, doctors, educators, journalists, all of that now 20 years later is really in great peril. We see it, we know it. For any of us to think that the Taliban will be any more cooperative than they were is just insane. And so what formed a lot of our work and my work personally, even after I left the White House, the U.S. Afghan Women's Council still continues. 4 administrations have supported it. Both Hillary Clinton and Laura Bush are the co-chairs side by side all these years. And both of them are heartbroken and grieving of what is going to happen to women now.
David, let me ask you on sort of this notion of public service. I don't know if you saw, there was a great piece in the Post the other day about members of Congress talking about how 9/11 sort of inspired their public service, whether that was in the military or in intelligence services, and then now it's coming full circle and that they're members of Congress. But just your contemporaries, working on the Hill at that time, and what you saw sort of 9/11 just from that component of, inspiring people in it to, either run for office, join the military, join intelligence service, what you saw from your colleagues up on the Hill.
Sure. I mean, Washington's usually a pretty transitory place, right? A lot of people come in just for a couple of years and they go back home. I do think there was a difference with the 9/11 period, and Jason was mentioning that with a different sort of resolve that he saw with some of his classmates. A lot of the people I had gone to school with when I moved here were already aiming for careers in national security. So I think it opened a lot of new opportunities for people in that field. I mean, there was no Department of Homeland Security at the time this happened. It certainly shifted priorities and resources for a lot of different organizations. I think there was more of a call than there had been, as Jason was saying, also the 90s were sort of the Seinfeld ironic decade. But the sense that there's duty and that things are really, to country, to your fellow citizens and the people around the world, as Anita was saying, and that, there really is something on the line for that. So there's certainly members of Congress today from both parties who say, joined the military in that period and got their start in national service and public service that way. I'm not sure how that's changed over time, right? We obviously have this 20-year presence in Afghanistan, which we all know what's happened with that lately. There was the Iraq War and what happened with that. I think from the students I have, most of my students today tell me that their memories of international affairs, national security, and terrorism issues in classes I teach really start with ISIS in the mid 2010s. So, I hate to say that there's been something new since then. It hasn't had the same direct impact on their lives, but it's been that same sort of impact. So I think there's maybe a sense of unfinished business, but I think it's also harder for students today to, not having gone through it the first time, to realize what a big shift there was. And I can't really speak to whether the impact was different in a certain way for the people who lived through it, in college at that time.
I wanted to just get any last call for questions. I don't see any questions in the queue. So if anybody does have a question, please feel free to type that in there. But I also wanted to ask you, David, to go back, because you had mentioned it before, on the issue of anthrax, and sort of in those couple of weeks following 9/11, this scare that also existed in this country, these anthrax laden letters that were being delivered to people. Several people lost their lives. I know at NBC News, there was some sent to Tom Brokaw's assistant, and she was impacted by that. And then you, of course, working for Tom Daschle, that was another person who got one of these anthrax letters. And it wasn't really solved until many, many, many years later by the FBI, that it ended up being sort of a bioterrorist, a guy who was working in the government. But at the time, the letters that were sent, had 9/11, the date written on them. It was very sort of anti-American language in the letters. And people thought that it maybe was coming, from the people who had, caused 9/11. And what was that like on the Hill for you working in Daschle's office?
Yeah, so I tell my students that I'm generally pretty easygoing because I've already had my worst day at the office.
Yeah.
And 9/11 was obviously not a great experience, but being locked in an office suite with a biological weapon, I had to say that was a little bit more traumatizing directly. Yeah. There had been this case where there had been these mysterious mailings. I think the first one, they never even found the mailing, but somebody who worked for a newspaper in Florida died. One was sent to Tom Brokaw, the anchor of NBC News. I think the ABC News got one as well. In our case, it was a relatively new to DC intern in this situation as well, who opened up the mail this Monday morning, and this white cloud of powder spread everywhere. And at that time, because of these other media attacks, there had already been hoaxes. There had already been enough incidents on Capitol Hill where the Capitol Police came in with no protective gear and said, we're getting these all the time. Don't worry about it. And, we'll nasal swab the people in the immediate vicinity of it to begin with. And they very quickly said, all right, you know what? Nobody leaves. They posted armed National Guard at our doors to make sure we didn't leave, closed down the vents. And, there's various people in our office demanded testing and got it. People who said they couldn't, wouldn't have been exposed were. And ultimately, you had a few dozen people who ended up on Cipro, which is really not supposed to be taken long term, for more than 100 days. Or, those of us who have issues with Cipro, and there were some people, right. One person has Achilles tendon snapped from the effects of the drug. There's a warning label on Cipro now because of his case. Nobody got sick because there was detection, who worked on the Hill because there was detection right away. But that wasn't the case for, let's say, some U.S. postal workers who were exposed. And even though some of them demanded testing, they didn't have maybe the political pull. They didn't have the resources to make that happen. And there were, from my perspective, there were some really unfortunate differences based on socioeconomic status, based on race, that factored into this about who had access to resources and treatment. The immediate result as far as Capitol Hill went is they started microwaving the mail from then on. So it didn't make sense to send a letter to your member of Congress because it would come out very crispy by the time some staffer opened it. As you're saying, it took several years for the DNA test to be fully developed enough that the FBI finally determined it was actually the U.S. Army's head of anthrax defense research. And I guess his Cold War budget was being slashed, and he maybe saw 9/11 as a chance to become really relevant again. I remember at the time I was paying a lot of attention. The FBI said, these letters that say, Allah is great, death to America, death to Israel, these were clearly written by somebody who grew up speaking English. This is not a foreign source. The source of the spores was clearly domestic. There were different people who were named as being potential suspects by their coworkers, and none of them panned out. And ultimately, when they developed the genetic testing by 2008, they were able to name Bruce Ivins as the only person who had access to those spores. And we'll never really know what happened because he promptly, took a drug overdose and committed suicide before he was going to be arraigned. But to me, the really, the interesting part of this, interesting sort of a nice way to put it, is, in the 7-year FBI investigation, it became really clear after it was over that this guy had a real history of mental illness, had issued death threats to colleagues, had sent strange things in the mail to people before with coded messages. The only person who ever mentioned him to the FBI was a woman he'd threatened in college, and they sort of dismissed that because it was just an isolated piece of information. But it's just really weird that all of these people working in the national security sector in 7 years never thought to mention the person who was giving them death threats in their office as a potential source of the problem. So, we have this message here on the Metro today, the see it, say it.
Right.
I'm not sure enough people were doing that pre 9/11, or during anthrax as well.
And I guess before we go, I just wanted to see if anybody had any closing thoughts for students as we sort of approach the 9/11 anniversary tomorrow. I know, Anita, it's always a hard time for you. And, I think just because it's the 20th, there's even more attention on it. But Anita, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, I think at the end of the day, you're right. Every year, it is hard to go through this again. And this particular anniversary, of course, is more painful given what is happening right now in Afghanistan. And the valiant effort that people are making to try and get some of our Afghan allies out, to try and get some of the high risk women out, to get our Americans out, and all those things have to continue, of course. But what's left behind is what worries me. And in particular, the 3 families I've tried to get out for the last 3 weeks, and the failed attempts to get them out by plane and to get them out over land. And so they probably never will. But so that's particularly painful. But I will say, on one other note, which is also important to reflect and think about, how life, particularly for the families here of the 9/11 victims here in the United States, how life marches on for them. And in fact, just today, as I do every year, reach out to one of the children of one of the passengers on Flight 93. He was 10 years old when his father died, and the Bushes were very, very close to the Flight 93 families, and see them all the time, and they'll see them again tomorrow. But this one particular one, a terrific young man, and went on to finish school, go to graduate school, go to Harvard Business School, started a business, and now is getting married. And my husband and I will be at his wedding on the 4th of July in 2022. And so those are just, moments of resilience, which is a great message for young people and for all Americans. No matter what was done to us on that day, and the attempt at destroying our country, it tore down steel, but it didn't tear down our resolve, and it shouldn't. And we have to, just find ways to help our country heal, help our country be better. And I hope find that sense of unity that we did have for that brief, period of time after 9/11. It's possible and it's doable. It just takes people of goodwill to do it, and protect who we should be.
Yeah. Well said, Anita. Jason, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'll just say that every year on 9/11, I find myself thinking about the danger of absolute certainty. Whether it's about religious belief or political beliefs, I'm certainly driven by my beliefs and values. I think having faith or deep commitment to principles and values, those are all good things. But I think 9/11 illustrated, and subsequent events here and around the world have illustrated the tremendous danger when we are so absolutely certain of our rightness that we have zero room for doubt and can't leave any room for people who see the world differently. And so for me, that's, this time of year is always a reminder that as deeply as we believe in the things we believe in, and that's good, that doubt also has its value, and that absolute certainty is not necessarily something to strive for.
Right. And David, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking right now of 10 years ago, I did a 10th anniversary retrospective of 9/11, a different job. And all of my students then could tell you exactly where they were that day, and they could tell you what the weather was like. And I remember thinking that's not going to be the case at the 20th anniversary one, right? It's people who won't have been alive at that point. So I just think that it's important. Some of the things that Anita mentioned about what the Bush administration did to avoid these internal divisions that were, I think, so important at the time. A lot of mistakes were made with let's say, with some of the military occupations and other choices, domestic choices, but a lot of things were done right. And it's really important to recognize those, to learn from those, so that our students learn perhaps more recent history, I think, than they do maybe in school sometimes. Because we'll be confronted, hopefully not with anything like the same sort of circumstance ever again, but with a lot of the same choices. And I think it's really important to, not just to remember 9/11, to memorialize it, but to learn important lessons from it as well.
Yeah, very good point. Well, thank you all for sharing your stories and your recollections and reflections today. And I want to thank everybody who is watching as well. And it's good to see you all.
Thanks for moderating, Betsy.
Thank you.
And thank you,
Betsy.
Jason and David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.